Okay, let's finish up this week of lectures talking about some more information regarding the action potential. One thing that you have to understand is, remember, I said this was an all or nothing event. So there are various strengths of stimuli, and some stimuli are strong enough to cause an action potential to occur. Other stimuli are not strong enough. So a stimulus that's strong enough to trigger an action potential is called a threshold stimulus. And these stimuli that cause a depolarization to begin to occur. And once it reaches a certain level of depolarization, then the all or nothing event takes over. And that's called a threshold stimulus. Now, what's on the diagram here shown as failed initiations is also called subthreshold stimulus. And that's a stimulus that occurs, but is just not strong enough to trigger an action potential. Now, your book also mentions something called a local potential, which I just mentioned because your book mentions it. This is a slight change in potential difference that really doesn't amount to anything. Now, once a neuron has had an action potential, it goes through what's known as a refractory period. And a refractory period is the time in which an action potential cannot be generated, or there's a change in its ability to generate an action potential, because as you'll see from my definitions to come here, not all refractory periods are the same. Now, if the neuron could not generate an action potential no matter what, then it's called an absolute refractory period. And this is the time where no matter how strong the stimulus is, the neuron cannot respond. And this is the darker shaded area. You can see that, and you could understand why it would sort of be impossible in the middle of an action potential for the neuron to try to generate another action potential. That would be almost impossible, or it would be impossible. The relative refractory period is the period where a neuron is capable of responding, but it requires a stronger than normal stimulus for that to occur. And this is the yellow part of this diagram. And you could see that the reason why is that the neuron is trying to reestablish its resting potential, and during that time, it's relatively resistant to depolarization from another stimulus. Now, this shows how the myelin works and why nerves, particularly nerves outside the central nervous system, are myelinated. Unmyelinated nerve is shown in A, and what you see is the progression of an action potential. The resting state shows the negative inside and the positive outside of this axon. And you see this little red area here is a action potential in progress with a negative on the outside and a positive on the inside. And you can see in order for the process to continue, it has to go all the way down the entire length of the axon on A. And, if it takes so many milliseconds for each of these plus points to occur, this is a slow process, a relatively slow process. On B, it shows how the presence of the myelin sheath allows for parts of the neural axon to be skipped. And so it jumps. In the first B, you see it's starting at the left. The second diagram B, you see it's in the second position. The third diagram B, it's jumped to the third position, and then so forth. And this is actually called a saltatory movement, meaning a stepwise movement. And this, because it doesn't have to depolarize the entire axon, but just little sections of the axon, this is much quicker than an unmyelinated nerve. And multiple sclerosis, which is a disease you've probably heard of, is damage to the myelin. And you can see why, if the myelin is damaged, it can cause a considerable amount of problems with nerve conduction. Now, let's talk about how nerve cells transmit signals from one nerve cell to another nerve cell. so-called synaptic transmission. There's two neurons involved in the synaptic transition. There's the presynaptic neuron, and this is the neuron that has the action potential, carries the action potential into the synapse. Now, the synapse, by the way, is the gap between one neuron and the next neuron. Neurons do not touch each other, but they have gaps in between, and the electrical activity has to be transmitted across that gap, and that's what's known as synaptic transmission. And so the neuron that carries the impulse into the gap is called the presynaptic neuron. And then the postsynaptic neuron is the one that carries the action potential away from the gap or away from the synapse. And this is a stylized view of the synapse, the gap, which is X here. The presynaptic neuron is Y, or the presynaptic terminal is Y. W is the postsynaptic area, and Z is labeling the neurotransmitter. So the way in which this transmission occurs is called a chemical synapse. And a chemical synapse can be excitatory, that is, it causes a action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, or it can be inhibitory. And it's done by a chemical, and that chemical is called a neurotransmitter. But you can also, as I said, you can have an inhibitory synapse. That is, a signal from the presynaptic neuron can actually prevent the postsynaptic neuron from firing. And the space between the two, the space that the neurotransmitter has to pass, is called the synaptic cleft. So here's sort of, again, a stylized way in which this works. What you start out with, look at the picture on the left, look at the number 1, and you see an arrow showing that calcium is entering into the cell. And this is what happens, is the action potential or nerve impulse comes down the axon, and it reaches this point of the axon. When it depolarizes, the channels that open also let in calcium as well as sodium. The calcium then interacts with these little bubbles that contain the neuron transmitter. These are called synaptic vesicles. The synaptic vesicles, once they've been acted on by calcium, migrate to the end of the presynaptic neuron, and they discharge, and this is point 2 on the diagram, they discharge their material into the space. This then, you'll notice that the channels are closed in most cases, but it crosses at 3, and then when it binds, those channels open up and allow sodium to enter, so that the postsynaptic neuron now depolarizes and then begins a new action potential. And that's 4. And if you look at the diagram on the right, you see an enlargement of this channel. What happens is the neurotransmitter binds the channel, opens it up, and allows sodium to enter through the postsynaptic membrane into the cell. Once the neurotransmitter is degraded, the channel then closes, and that's the end of the transmission. The sodium enters, and it's just like the previous diagrams, where once the sodium enters, the potential difference decreases towards 0, and if it reaches the threshold, then it fires on its own and carries the action potential down through the next neuron. Now, as I said, you have these can occur either excitatory or inhibitory. An excitatory impulse occurs when an excitatory action potential comes in. If the postsynaptic event is excitatory, then it results in an action potential. However, if it's inhibitory, it does not revolt. It actually prevents an action potential to occur. And you can see how these sorts of things can be controlled by combinations of excitatory and inhibitory impulses until one or the other wins out. Now, sometimes one action potential alone is not sufficient to cause a postsynaptic event. And therefore, you need a sum or an addition of several action potentials. And these can occur in one of two ways. The same neuron can fire several times in a row, and that's called temporal summation, and that's shown on the bottom. The same neuron firing several times leads to an action potential. Or you can have spatial, where one action potential from one neuron is insufficient, but you have several of these firing all at the same time, and it leads to an action potential. And so you can either have one axon firing several times in a short period of time, leading to an action potential, or you can have several neurons firing and leading to the same event. Now we'll finish, and this is the last slide, with something called a neural circuit. And we already showed that you can have several excitatory or inhibitory or combination thereof. So a neural circuit can be either convergent or divergent, as it's shown here, is when several neurons fire on a single neuron and the impulse converges to one impulse. Divergent is when one neuron fires and affects several neurons so that the impulse diverges from one to many. So it either converges from many to one or diverges from one to many.